Every day we witness the darker side of the world around us. We see how people can hurt others in ways that are difficult to comprehend. It's a harsh reality, one we cannot ignore. As someone deeply immersed in the world of crime, I am here to share the most shocking stories and explore what drives people to commit such acts. Well, to my channel, and today, I bring you another incredible true crime story. Death at Sweet Delights. The town of Willowbrook had always been known for its charm, cobblestone streets, flower-laden shop fronts, and the kind of community where everyone knew each other. But nothing was more beloved than Sweet Delights, the cozy little ice cream parlor on the corner of Maple Street. It had been there for over 40 years, run by the kind and motherly Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose sweet treats seemed to bring joy to everyone who visited. But one summer evening, that joy melted into something far more sinister. A chilling discovery. Jake Reynolds was the first to find her. The 17-year-old assistant had worked at Sweet Delights for 3 years, scooping cones and sweeping floors under Mrs. Hayes' warm guidance. That morning, he arrived at 6:30 a.m., as usual, expecting to prepare waffle cones and refill toppings before the shop opened. The moment he stepped inside, a shiver ran through him. Something was off. The smell of vanilla and chocolate was thick in the air, but underneath it, something metallic, coppery. Blood. He moved slowly toward the counter, heart pounding. And then he saw her. Mrs. Hayes lay motionless on the checkered black and white floor, her sky blue apron stained with something dark. Her gray hair, always neatly pulled back, was now messy, strands sticking to her pale, lifeless face. Next to her outstretched hand was a single overturned waffle cone, the ice cream melted into a sickly sweet puddle. Jake let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a stool. His shaking hands fumbled for his phone. 911, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's Mrs. Hayes. She's dead. The investigation begins. Detective Laura Grayson arrived within the hour, her sharp hazel eyes sweeping over the scene. The crime scene was bizarre. There was no forced entry, no sign of struggle, and the cash register was untouched. "Who found her?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I did," Jake said, still pale. I got here early to open the shop." Laura nodded, taking in his trembling hands. "Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Jake hesitated. "No, I mean, everyone loved Mrs. Hayes." Laura examined the body closely. There were no obvious injuries, no gunshot wounds, no knife marks. But something wasn't right. She turned her attention to the ice cream that had spilled from the fallen cone. A soft, bitter scent lingered. "Almonds," she muttered. She looked up at her forensic analyst, who was already collecting samples. "Send this to the lab. I have a feeling we're dealing with poison." Thus, a town in shock. As news of Mrs. Hayes' death spread through Willowbrook, the town was consumed by grief and speculation. "I just can't believe it," murmured Lillian Carter, Mrs. Hayes' best friend and fellow business owner. "She was the heart of this town." "Who would want to kill her?" asked Mr. Thompson, the elderly bookstore owner next door. That was the question haunting everyone. The toxicology report arrived within a day, confirming Laura's suspicion: cyanide poisoning. Someone had laced Mrs. Hayes' own ice cream with a lethal dose of poison. Now, the hunt was on for a killer. Suspects and secrets. Laura began questioning those closest to Mrs. Hayes. Jake Reynolds, the boy who found the body. His alibi checked out. He had no reason to kill the woman who had been like a grandmother to him. But something about his shaken expression told Laura he knew more than he was letting on. Lillian Carter, her best friend of 30 years. She claimed to have no idea why anyone would want Eleanor dead, but there had been whispers that Mrs. Hayes was planning to leave Sweet Delights to Jake instead of her. Could jealousy have played a role? Daniel Hayes, Mrs. Hayes' estranged nephew. He had never cared much for the ice cream business, but financial records showed that Mrs. Hayes had recently changed her will, cutting him out completely. That kind of motive couldn't be ignored. A mysterious customer. A young woman had come into the shop the night before, arguing with Mrs. Hayes. The security footage was grainy, but it showed her slamming something on the counter before storming out. No one knew who she was. Cracking the case. Digging through Mrs. Hayes' files, Laura found something interesting. A series of threatening letters. They warned her to watch her back and stay out of things that don't concern you. But what had she been involved in? Then Laura received another call. Lab results from the ice cream mixture. The cyanide hadn't been mixed in at random. It had been deliberately added to one specific tub, almond fudge swirl, and only a handful of people knew that was Mrs. Hayes' favorite. The killer, unmasked. The security footage was enhanced, revealing the identity of the mystery woman, Samantha Lowe, a former employee who had been fired months ago for stealing from the shop. Laura tracked her down to a rundown motel outside town. Confronted with the evidence, Samantha broke down. "She ruined my life," she sobbed. "I needed that job, and she fired me like I was nothing." Fueled by rage and desperation, Samantha had planned to scare Mrs. Hayes by poisoning one batch of ice cream, never expecting her to taste it herself. But Mrs. Hayes had, and now she was dead. Justice and a new beginning Samantha was arrested, the town shaken but relieved that the killer had been caught. A month later, Sweet Delights reopened, this time with Jake at the helm. The first scoop he served was Mrs. Hayes' favorite, almond fudge swirl, made exactly the way she had taught him. As the town gathered to celebrate the reopening, Jake smiled. Mrs. Hayes was gone, but her legacy would never melt away. Even in death, her sweetness remained.